Ever find yourself waiting endlessly at a big box pharmacy, feeling like just another number? At Tablet Pharmacy, they provide the personalized service you deserve. They offer free delivery and blister packaging options to make managing your medications easier than ever. Check their competitive prices online at tabletpharmacy.ca.
Hello, friends. I am Cindy Thompson, and this is a Resilience Project. This is a space where stories are shared and possibilities are discovered. I invite you to partner with me in cultivating resilience among humans, one conversation at a time. In this episode, I have the privilege of speaking with Katie Bergman, a writer and social justice advocate. As you will hear in our conversation, Katie has spent a lot of time thinking about the interplay between inner well-being and social change. Katie has devoted the last 10 years of her career to the nonprofit sector, specializing in human trafficking interventions. She has worked with teams around the world, contributing to projects such as preventing labor exploitation among migrant workers in rural Colombia, supporting a home for survivors of human trafficking in the U.S., and protecting at-risk girls from abuse in Bulgaria. A few years into her nonprofit career, Katie began to recognize how individual, systemic, and societal factors can adversely impact the mental health and well-being of people in helping roles. After her own experience of trauma and burnout at the front lines, Katie published her first book, When Justice Just Is, to open up a conversation about how caring for the world requires us to care for ourselves. Katie seeks to balance her work through replenishing activities like writing, running, camping, quality time with her community, and traveling. She has explored nearly 30 countries, from the fjords of Montenegro to the rainforests of Malaysia, and has many more still on her bucket list. So Katie, thank you so much for being on a Resilience Project here today as our guest.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
When I anticipated our conversation today, I was thinking about how you've got a message for us of having such a big heart and diving in and really having a passion for helping others. But with that can lead us down a bit of a path towards burnout.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you tell us what led you into the humanitarian field? What was it that sparked an interest for you in that work?
I mean, I really attribute it to just the way that I grew up. I was raised in a family that really valued service. My dad was a pastor and my mom was a nurse. They both spent 30 plus year careers doing work to help the community. So there was never the expectation that I would necessarily also have a career in a field like that. But I grew up seeing how normal it was to devote a life to service. So I think being exposed to that in the way that my parents were working was one aspect. And then I think another is just that I was just a deeply sensitive, compassionate kid. I grew up in a small prairie town in rural Saskatchewan and wasn't exposed to a lot of suffering firsthand, but I learned about it through books and through movies. And so as a child, I spent a lot of time reading about the civil rights movement and the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman and Martin Luther King Jr. and was just really heartbroken to learn about these terrible things that have happened in our world, while also being really fascinated by the activists who committed their lives to seeking justice. So that was hugely inspiring to me. And so as I grew up and became a teenager, I just looked for whatever outlets I could to be involved in community service, which in a small town of 1,200 people, there wasn't a lot.
Sure.
Yeah. So then I, went away to university and studied justice formally there. And in my final year of university, I had the opportunity to do some field work. And so I spent a semester living and volunteering in Mexico, working with kids with physical and intellectual disabilities who are living in poverty. And it was a heart-wrenching and life-changing experience for me on so many levels, especially being so young. And that was really what sort of launched me into full-time work in social justice.
Interesting. I'm just imagining someone who is sensitive with a big heart, that when you would see even that one aspect of a population, I can just imagine the fire that was lit inside of you.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I had the compassion and I had the empathy, but didn't have necessarily the tools to cope with seeing those things. And, being at an impressionable age, I was in my early 20s when I first started traveling to developing nations, working with vulnerable populations, and wasn't trained to sort of steward my well-being in doing that work. I was never really taught how to develop a contemplative practice within my work. We didn't talk about that in university. We didn't talk about that in my orientations. It was just all about, serving. So it was definitely, sort of an unsettling realization once I was a few years into this work and kind of had to retroactively respond to my own needs and realizing that, there actually needs to be some space in this work for me to address my own needs in order to help other people meet their needs.
So you had to kind of learn the hard way, it sounds like.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you have mentors or people that you had looked up to in the field that you thought, I want to be more like them when I grow up?
Yeah, I think that the people that I kind of put on a pedestal were, the people that had done these like grandiose works of justice, like people like Martin Luther King Jr. or, Rosa Parks or Mother Teresa, these people that had really lived this phenomenal life of service. And so that was kind of what I thought I was being called to do. And there's so much nobility that we often try to take on in doing this work. And I think that I kind of went in with the expectation that that's the level that I need to try and aspire to do in order to have an impact on the world. And that wasn't really a realistic aspiration, as I discovered, through my burnout.
Yeah. So tell me, along the way on your journey, you had this big dream of wanting to make a huge difference in our world. Was there a particular population that really sparked an interest for you?
In the 10 years or so that I've been working in the nonprofit sector, about 8 of those years I've spent doing work in human trafficking prevention. Yeah, in my early 20s, I just did an internship in Silicon Valley in near San Francisco, where kind of like my training grounds for learning more about this issue. At the time, that was 8 years ago or so, and there just wasn't a whole lot of awareness about human trafficking back then. So a lot of our work was just spent teaching people that this thing exists, that this crime is pervasive. So as I developed in my career, I started getting more involved in sort of direct service provision and wound up in Cambodia, where I was doing some work there in preventing human trafficking. And that was kind of where all this came to a head. That was sort of where I burned out, and very unexpectedly thinking that if you're working for a good cause, that's enough to sustain you. And I realized that that's not the case.
It makes me think about the checks and balances of giving and wanting to make a difference. And sometimes the change is slow. It's a greater system than what Katie or a group of people might be able to shift in even some way. You're still making a difference. What did you notice about the difference you were making versus what you were giving?
Yeah. So, I for sure brought my own individual factors to the work. I kind of came into it with, a lot of perfectionism and people pleasing and feeling like I need to be everything to everyone, feeling like caring for myself is selfish, it's indulgent. So certainly I had my own sort of individual factors that sort of set me up for burnout. But then, there's also so many structural difficulties at sort of the organizational and even societal level. So I think nonprofits are up against a lot of unique challenges. We're there to bring innovative, culturally appropriate, meaningful solutions to very complex problems like human trafficking with very limited resources on a shoestring budget. And we're sort of held to this different moral and performance standard than really any other industry. So we're constantly trying to do more with less, constantly needing to prove to our donors that we're doing more with less, while also, competing with our other organizations for funding. So that on its own kind of like sets you up for some significant challenges. But then, on top of those structural challenges are, I think, a lot of unhealthy and sort of dysfunctional practices and norms that are often unconsciously embedded into nonprofit cultures, like the belief that, we need to be constantly working in a state of urgency and overwhelm, or else we're doing something wrong. Staff are often faced with these untenable demands to do this work, unrealistic or poorly defined job descriptions, unattainable goals, a lot of other duties as assigned. For me, in one anti-trafficking organization that I worked for, my title was Director of Operations and Communications. And both of those things are really big tasks. And just focusing on one or the other would have been plenty, but I did both while also overseeing all of our programming. So the demands on staffing, I think, are often very unrealistic. And so staff are often very exhausted, and that exhaustion is normalized. And I think even sort of turned into a virtue where it prompts us to believe that if we're not physically and mentally exhausted, then we just must not be committed enough or strong enough or hardworking enough or brave enough. And it's not just a statement about our work ethic, it's a statement about our character. And then kind of, as you alluded to, like there's also just that emotional drain of knowing that our work is really never done. Human trafficking is a $150 billion a year criminal industry. It's the fastest growing criminal industry. It's the second largest next to drugs. And there's always more to do with that. There's never enough time or resources or capacity to fully address that. And so if we don't give our all, it feels like, well, then that's one life that we weren't able to help. And so I think there's a lot of guilt and savior complexes that come within this culture that go unchallenged and I think are even encouraged. So I think, the means isn't always consistent with the ends. Like organizations seeking to address exploitation out there in the world do so by sort of perhaps unintentionally exploiting their own workers.
Good point.
Yeah, so there are many challenges that you're up against. And again, it's not all, I think, necessarily intentional. It's just the way that we've structured nonprofits and, kind of consider it work that is nice to do, but doesn't necessarily get the same funding as other programming. So there's so many challenges that you come up against. And as, in my case, as a 20-something entering this industry, I was not prepared for any of that.
Well, I can appreciate so many good points there, Katie. I really value that you're bringing that to the table because I can only imagine others like yourself have embarked on starting a nonprofit in order to make a difference. But perhaps in that process, their passion, their excitement for it creates a culture of potentially burning people out. Because you're right, the tendency is if we just work harder and faster or more, then surely we're going to make more of a difference. But human nature is such that we can only sustain that for a period of time.
Absolutely.
So would you mind sharing, Katie, what have you learned about yourself as well in your 20s as you found yourself still passionate about the area, being involved and making a difference in this world, but also hitting a wall?
Yeah, absolutely. For a lot of years, I worked within that framework of overwork and overwhelm, and really, quite frankly, was almost a poster child for it. I, wholeheartedly believed that to serve is to suffer, that productivity is the most important measurement of my worth, that rest is unproductive, and that it's only available to me once I've earned it. And even then, it's something I should feel guilty about and should minimize. And the strategy worked for me for a while, and it afforded me some really incredible opportunities with organizations at the front lines of human trafficking interventions. I have gotten to work in places like the slums in the Philippines and with at-risk Roma communities in Bulgaria and red light district in Greece and ethnic minorities in Taiwan. So it really offered me some incredible opportunities because, I was willing to work really hard for them. But eventually that strategy fell apart for me. So I really see sort of this mindset when I started working in Cambodia. So, 23 years old, I decided that the best and most noble way that I could optimize my efforts to seek justice was to do so in the most demanding way possible. It really only counts if you're struggling. So I moved to the other side of the world, to Cambodia, to work at the front lines of human trafficking prevention. So I was committed to a 5-month internship with the Relief and Development Organization, conducting research that would be used to pilot a livelihoods project that would increase access to training and employment to reduce people's vulnerability to exploitation and human trafficking. And about 2 or 3 months into my work there, about halfway through my internship, my supervisor quit. So even though I had very little translatable experience as a 23-year-old, my boss offered me her job. So at 23, I suddenly became a program manager supervising 20 Cambodian staff, many of whom were at least twice my age, and figured that the only way to compensate for my lack of experience was to work twice as hard. So I did. And I worked overtime every day, working on weekends. I had wildly unrealistic expectations of myself and turned suffering into a virtue, wearing my exhaustion as a badge of honor, and really believed that my duty was to be everything to everyone else, and anything less than that was a failure. And so, as you might have guessed, that didn't end well. I started forgetting things. I started feeling anxious and detached and had trouble sleeping and physically collapsed. And when I finally got help, because there really was no other option, I literally so worn out that I couldn't function. It became clear that I couldn't fulfill my duties and had to leave Cambodia numb and defeated, and believing that not only had I betrayed my staff, but I'd betrayed this cause and myself.
That's heavy stuff.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And especially at 23, I didn't have the tools to, really cope from that. And so the way that I perceived that experience, what I internalized was, I'm just not cut out for this work. I think I took on a lot of shame and believed that, well, I guess maybe burnout really only happens in extreme conditions. So I started working for nonprofits in Canada and the US, thinking I'll be more protected in this environment. But I really hadn't solved some of the issues that had led me to burnout. I was still working for organizations that really were very under-resourced and sort of ill-equipped to provide adequate support for staff. So 6 years later, I burned out a second time in my 20s. And this time, I just really believed I'm just not cut out for this work whatsoever. So I think shame is just such a powerful tool. And the shame from both of those experiences, I think, really limited my ability to see the bigger picture, that while I certainly brought with me my own factors, that there were also broader systemic factors at play, and that in both of those contexts, I had little to no support or training. I had a severe lack of resources to do my job, really unclear job descriptions, and yet incredibly high demands, and some dysfunctional workplace dynamics, like some spiritual manipulation that included, but were not limited to, things like, well, the Apostle Paul was persecuted and shipwrecked and imprisoned, and so he never gave up, and so neither should you. Or in one case, when I was asked to go on a really dangerous overseas work assignment in an unstable country when I was not at a good place, I was told, well, God can use your vulnerability. So again, though, what reason did I really have, though, to look at these broader systemic factors when these aren't really things that we talk about? And, sort of the popular definition and understanding of burnout focuses on the individual symptoms, not the bigger systemic problems.
I often think about, we do what we know. And so if you could have had a mentor, somebody to really walk alongside you and to speak to balance, to give you that 10,000 foot view of the difference you're making, but also the importance of well-being, you can hear how misled some people who are in these nonprofit organizations also don't have the tools, and they're just doing what they know as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things about the nonprofit sector is it often draws in a lot of people who for sure are the bleeding heart, people like myself who just really care and want to give and want to help. But I think it also draws in people who have experienced tremendous trauma. And so their way of coping is to try and help others. And that's not inherently a bad thing, but there definitely are people working in this context who come with a huge amount of baggage and aren't dealing with that baggage, but also aren't really given permission to deal with it. We're so focused on service provision and efficiency. And so there's not really space to try and unpack those struggles and those challenges, which is to everyone's detriment in the end.
And you can hear where people are coming from is with a good intention, but misled in the balance, misled in how those messages then can have an impact on someone like yourself who might get discouraged from doing that work, really have a passion for it, but gets discouraged and starts to believe like you did that you maybe were not cut out for it. What is the message that you have about yourself now, Katie, in looking back retrospectively?
Yeah, it's been a really beautiful opportunity to look back at that time and to see it with a different lens, and to see that as much as I beat myself up for not being strong enough, not having better boundaries, I think I can look back at that time with self-compassion, and I can see the bigger systemic factors as well as my own individual factors that sort of led to that really difficult time in my life. And I think for me, what I've been focusing on more is that well-being isn't about eliminating suffering. It's not possible to do that. Adversity is part of life, but there are ways to engage with that from a more self-compassionate place. So I think that that's been, a really huge lesson for me and a really important tool in being able to both look back at that time of my life with self-compassion and then also engage with my work now with that compassion, which I think is really just about speaking to myself the way that I would speak to a friend, with gentleness and kindness, and with acknowledging that we've all been there, we all struggle. It's just a part of being human. I think that that's been a really big sort of lesson that I've learned. Another is just acknowledging that just because I can doesn't mean I should. Our society really constructs limits in a way that we're supposed to be defying them and pushing our limits and knowing no limits. And I really think that there's a big difference between challenging ourselves and pushing our limits. And so I think something that I've started to learn is that limits aren't necessarily the enemy. They're actually kind of a gift. They help us to realize that, we can't do this work on our own. We can't do life on our own. I think that limits are really an opportunity to invite community in and to ask for help and to recognize that maybe there's an unmet need here that I need to address. I think that's another really, powerful thing that I've been learning. Another is just that joy and service are not mutual exclusives. I think that they actually function best together.
That's wonderful. I love that. And I love that you're really looking in also. What is this serving for me? And in looking inside first to say, what is motivating me? What is the driving force here? And where is the value? Is it life-giving? Or is it just draining? And is it a never-ending searching, almost like a drug, for that next hit in a way of something meaningful or doing something good? But then we get accustomed to that place and then we have to do more.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in that pursuit of trying to meet our own needs, it's not just a nice thing to do, it's necessary. That's where the whole joy and service not being mutual exclusive. I often thought that fighting against the darkness means that I need to be in darkness myself. Like I need to be sort of in this place of scarcity. What I'm learning is that fighting against the darkness doesn't eliminate us from living in the light. In fact, we need to be living in the light in order to do this work. We need to give ourselves the grace to enjoy the beauty in the world in order to see it as a place worth redeeming. So I think it's so vital that we're allowing ourselves to experience joy, knowing that it's not just a nice thing, it's actually a sustaining thing.
Yes, it's critical, isn't it? Because if we are just in this heavy darkness, nothing grows from that. Things grow in the light.
Absolutely.
There was a quote I just wanted to grab that I captured from your website, actually. And it says, "Does my worth come from trying to become a hero, or is my worth inherent as a human, created carefully and inherently for the purpose to love and be loved?" That's a great quote, Katie.
Thank you. I think it took me a long time to really sit with that. And I think that, like, overall, I would say that most people probably know the basic things that we need to live well. We know that we need sleep and exercise and nutrition and positive interactions with other people. But for some reason, there's a barrier in us accessing those, because how many of us can check off all those boxes and say, I'm doing these things all the time? So I think for me, what an important question has been, what's stopping me from accessing those things? Like, what's stopping me from getting enough sleep or exercise or nutrients or quality time with loved ones? And I think that, like many people, I always told myself that, well, I just don't have time. I don't have time to take care of myself. But I think that was the safe answer. And I think it's a safe answer because we live in a culture that venerates busyness. It's culturally appropriate in this context to say, well, I don't have time to care for myself because I'm so busy taking care of everybody else. But I think what was really underneath that was a belief that I actually don't think I'm worthy of taking care of myself. And that's been just such a powerful realization for me. And I think that for sure, there's a lot of factors that sort of reinforce that. As a woman, I've been conditioned to believe that my role in society is to give all of myself in as many different ways as I can. The faith tradition that I grew up in professed that the most important thing that we can do is to love our neighbors as ourselves. And yet rarely do we talk about how that implies that we love ourselves to begin with. I internalized a lot of messages about how self-care is selfish, and then went out into the world, into the workplace, where these cultures aren't set up for flourishing. They're set up for competition based on this belief of scarcity, that there's only so much wealth and success and power to go around. And so you need to hustle for it by any means necessary. There's so many of these external factors in addition to my own internal ones, the ways that I see the world and myself. And the world, as we know, it really isn't set up for us to love ourselves and to take care of ourselves. And so that's something that I think I've really had to grapple with and realize that in order for me to meet my own needs, I need to realize that I'm worthy of meeting them in the first place.
Thank you for bringing that forward. I think that is so valuable. Again, you're looking inside. Am I worthy of this? What's getting in the way of my looking after myself? And a great message for resilience, because if we don't look at what those key components are, how can we then weather what the next storm might bring, what the next bit of adversity? Whereas I look at those practices that you're talking about as integral to sustainability for you as a human being, but also putting yourself in that mix. People, I think, have an adverse reaction when I say, put yourself first. And yet when you fill your tank, then you have so much more to give others.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So being aware of those messages that we give ourselves, to be aware of biases, old learnings that we might have picked up as a society, social media, generations and generations of teachings. So what's in your future, Katie?
Yeah, that's a great question. A few years ago, I decided to write about this. So about 6 years ago now, I just felt like there aren't enough conversations about the real challenges of working in this industry. And I just wanted to open up that conversation. So in 2013, I started writing a book called When Justice Just Is. And I was writing it at a time when talking about well-being and mental health, not just in the nonprofit sector, but in the workplace, was kind of more taboo than not. And public campaigns like Bell Let's Talk were just really starting to get started. And I wasn't really aware of any resources that were specifically addressing well-being in the nonprofit sector. And so I just decided that I'm young and I don't have a ton of experience. I don't have a ton of training, but I have gone through this experience of burnout and mental health challenges. And I know that I'm not alone. I know that this is rampant. And I want us to be able to destigmatize these conversations, because not having them is actually, far more harmful than having them. That was a few years ago now, and I've now since gone through 2 burnouts, and so have, kind of more insight into what that looks like and what that experience is like. And so I definitely see myself wanting to continue having these conversations, even like this one right here with you, Cindy. It's so wonderful to be able to have the opportunity to make space for talking about self-compassion and boundaries and how these things are sustaining. And not only for us, but it really gives permission for other people to follow suit as well. So I see myself as being in this industry for my career. It's something that I was very passionate about ever since I was a little kid, and see myself continuing to do, but just engaging with it in a different way. I see myself in this work for the long haul. And I think that my reason behind doing this work has really expanded. Sort of the original reason was I just want to help and, bring hope to people and communities that are suffering, especially those who have been impacted by human trafficking. So naturally, I was expecting to find that pain in other people who have been abused and trafficked and have gone through horrible things. But, I wasn't expecting to find that pain in my organization itself and with the people that I'm working with and within myself. So my vision has really expanded to wanting to really support healing and the flourishing of all people, including those at the helm of change-making work.
Well, help comes in many ways, doesn't it? Like, we don't always have to be boots on the ground doing that work in Cambodia or any number of those places that you might recognize a need, including Winnipeg and your own backyard. And so it's important to recognize that your type of help that you're providing now, whether it's through your book, whether it's through speaking on it, creating awareness. I know that as a leadership coach, I have this passion for working with nonprofits, and I would love to just be that person to support the change that can then happen. And that's what you're doing. You're bringing an awareness to health, an awareness of what does wellness look like within the nonprofits. So then their goals can be met astronomically when you look after the people doing the work, and it's sustainable.
I'm so glad that you brought up that point. You're absolutely right. I think it really just comes down to when we talk about wanting to make the world a better place, that might be in your own backyard. And that might not even be, a formal 9-to-5 job. It might just be in the context of a pandemic, looking out for your neighbors or checking in on a friend who lives alone. It's more just about our collective well-being. And that's something that all of us can participate in.
So yeah, like you've been talking about, remembering what you can give, not trying to be a hero necessarily, but to do that self-assessment first. Because I know even from my field, working with people throughout the week in many different ways, I know that I don't have that capacity to go out and volunteer in a big way every week. But I try to find other ways, like maybe this podcast that might be a way of making a difference that can bring your story to the forefront and create an awareness about something. But we have to figure out what that niche is going to be for ourselves. And hearing your story, Katie, and what you've learned about yourself, I love that you are recognizing this in yourself. I'm sorry that you had to hit that wall and go through that. And sometimes in our life, that's how we have to learn, unfortunately, because we can get our blinders on and just press on thinking if I just work harder and longer, maybe it'll make a difference or I'll get to my goal. So you're really pulling out some really important pieces here that I think many of us can learn from, not just in the nonprofit sector. Anybody out there who's volunteering or involved in an organization, they might then look at their team and say, what is the message that I'm sending? What is the culture that we're setting up here? And I'll often talk to leaders about, for example, do you take lunch? Because your people are watching. If you take lunch, they're going to know that it's okay to take lunch. So you might be telling them to take lunch, but whether or not you're doing that, they're watching to see what our culture is. So just simple examples like that can be identified as little small changes that might then set a healthier culture. So I'm excited for what you're going to do in the future. I'm excited for the change that you're going to continue to bring. I have no doubt. I hope that people will check out your book because I do think this is a valuable resource for people to tap into and learn from.
We're having this conversation at just over the year mark of being in this pandemic. And I'm mindful of the fact that, maybe over a year ago, the topic of resilience might not have been sort of at top of mind for people, but it likely has started to filter through at this point. And so what a lot of the work and the research that I've been doing has been around the nonprofit context or caregiving context, but really like these principles are for everybody, not just for frontline workers. We could all stand to be more self-compassionate. We could all learn how we need to be making deposits in our resilience bank account, especially in times like these. I just saw a survey just this week on CBC that was talking about how more than half of Canadians have been feeling an increased stress and anxiety due to COVID. And that's even higher among people who are like 35 and under. It's more like 60%.
Interesting.
And this is acknowledging that people were probably stressed and anxious before COVID. And now that's just been exacerbated. And so now, like a year into this pandemic, our surge capacity has been diminished. The systems that we relied on for short-term survival for those first few weeks of the pandemic, those were temporary. And so a pandemic with no end in sight easily depletes our emotional and mental reserves. So these things that we've been talking about are so applicable to what we're all collectively going through right now. We all experience loss, whether, it may have been the loss of a person, or, it might be a more ambiguous loss, like the loss of an experience or a routine, and all of that's valid. And I think that now is really an opportunity for us to learn how to be taking care of ourselves and what works for us. I think that like a problem with the concept of self-care is that companies have realized that their products can be packaged and marketed as self-care. And so while they may offer avenues to taking care of ourselves, it's usually more on sort of a superficial level, and it's typically not offering us a path to loving ourselves. So we kind of constructed self-care to be a spa day or a shopping spree, and things that we can only access when we have the time or the funds. And I think that's where I'm more interested in talking about self-compassion, because that's something that is accessible to us all the time. We can access that in a stressful meeting. We can access that during an argument with a loved one. I think that, now, as difficult as these experiences are that all collectively facing, I think that it really is an opportunity for us to learn what works for us. Yoga might not work for everybody. Going for a run might not work for everybody. So what is the thing that you connect with that really helps you to restore and replenish your reserves? I think now is just such a key time to be paying attention to that.
I appreciate you bringing that up. Thank you. And I love the self-compassion piece. I think that's definitely a theme through our conversation today, because it's almost like each of those moments of self-compassion are like little spa moments. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be at a formal spa necessarily, but cumulatively, they're little moments of being aware of the toxic thoughts, being aware of how hard we can be on each other or on ourselves. And so setting a tone for that. Katie, thank you again for taking some time out to talk about your book, to talk about your journey and recognize your experiences that you've been through. To share that with others is such a gift to us. I have no doubt that there's going to be somebody out there listening to this conversation and recognize a little bit of themselves and to perhaps create some changes either in their organization or within their own little world or their experiences to have more self-compassion. So I appreciate your wisdom.
Thank you, Cindy. Thanks so much for making space. Thank you for having this podcast and for just offering us the opportunity to do some self-reflection, especially in times like these.
Well, thank you, Katie. We're creating a village of resilient people together.
Love it.
Katie is uncovering a topic that is critical to the well-being of many. With a heart for humanitarian work, you can hear the firsthand experience that has been tested over time. Whether it is speaking to nonprofit organizations, missionaries, or other humanitarian work, the message of prevention, boundaries, and self-compassion are critical to the conversation. There are so many highlights in this conversation, it's hard to narrow it down. Katie has given us a slightly different framework for self-care, reminding us that compassion, unlike a spa day or vacation, does not require time or financial resources. By integrating self-compassion into your everyday practice, you are adjusting expectations for yourself and embracing a kinder approach to what it is to be human. If I were to create a bumper sticker from this episode, it would be something along the lines of, exhaustion is not a virtue, or that joy and service are not mutually exclusive. We can find purpose and meaning in helping others, but we can also find that sweet spot of replenishing our resilience bank account. If we were to identify risk factors for burnout, we would include unhealthy beliefs such as to serve is to suffer, rest is unproductive, it only counts when you're struggling, or in buying into the guilt and savior complex. Do these sound familiar? Do you have a few more you might add? If you recognized more than one of these unhelpful thought patterns, I could only ask, how have they been serving you so far? Drawing on some really important questions from this conversation, I invite you to write down and reflect on the following. If you're driving right now, you might even want to pull over and consider what these mean to you. What beliefs do you have on the value of rest and balance? What is stopping you from spending quality time with friends and family? What is stopping you from getting enough sleep? Do you believe you are worthy of looking after yourself? What are the ways in which you could steward your well-being? And finally, what helps you replenish and restore? Honoring the immense value that can come from helping others in our own backyard or other parts of the world, I encourage you to find the light in the process, because as you know, that is where abundant growth is most likely to occur. Thank you for listening to this episode of A Resilience Project. We would not be doing this podcast without you. If you or someone you know has an inspirational story or is helping to build resilience in their community, please email me at cindy@aresilienceproject.com. In fact, email me either way. I would love to hear from you. My hope is to feature an episode periodically on your letters of resilience. I'm very interested in hearing your story of how you have tackled hard things and what worked for you. With your permission, I hope to share some of these stories along the way with our listeners. Also, check out my website, aresilienceproject.com, to learn more about our amazing guests. Your presence here is important because together we are cultivating a village of resilient individuals. You are creating a space for their stories to be shared and a sacred space for learning to occur. I also have a favor. I would love for you to go to your preferred podcast platform, rate and review the podcast so that we will know how we're doing. I also would like to express my gratitude to the amazing team of volunteers that have jumped on board to support this project. You will find each of those beautiful people on my website on the team page. As you go about this week, I invite you to think about one way that you can continue to grow your resilient muscle. What is one thing you can start with today? See you next week.
Ever find yourself waiting endlessly at a big box pharmacy, feeling like just another number? At Tablet Pharmacy, they provide the personalized service you deserve. They offer free delivery and blister packaging options to make managing your medications easier than ever. Check their competitive prices online at tabletpharmacy.ca